One person cannot control 20 million people. It's not possible. You need an army of willing slaves. If you're going to be a tyrant, you need an army of willing slaves. What sort of slave do you have to be tyrannized by a single tyrant? How about the kind of slave that abandons the meaning of his words? And that brings us to the Tower of Babel. I don't know if you've been following the news in recent days. I said that the children of Cain were the engineers. But more particularly, they're the builders who put what they build in the place that's reserved for God. They're the prideful intellect's temptation to elevate the technological enterprise to the highest possible place, to look for salvation in the technological realm. What happened to Google in the last 2 days? The Google engineers, along with computer engineers everywhere, are madly engaged in the construction of superintelligences that have mapped the domain of the word. And Google devoted its AI project to unholy ideological propositions and produced a superintelligence whose image-making capacity instantly falsified not only the present but the past in the service of those delusional presumptions. That's a Tower of Babel. This is the story. And the whole earth was of one language and one speech. That's the symbol on the back of the dollar bill. What does it mean? It means there's a hierarchy of value, and that everything within that hierarchy of value should be devoted to one thing, which is at its apex, which isn't part of the thing, but rises above it, that's associated with clear-eyed vision. That's the symbol of value that your economy is predicated upon. This ancient idea. Why is that of one language and of one speech? Because a hierarchy of value that has the appropriate attentive eye at its pinnacle unites people psychologically and socially. To the degree that your country is united, it's united because you all act out and implicitly believe the same story. And the story is symbolized in that image. What's at the top? What does Christ say in the Gospels? There are none so blind as those who will not see. Well, that's the opposite. This symbol is the opposite of that. It's the story that unites man and society properly, places the eye that is willing to see whatever is in front of it at the pinnacle of all. To the degree that a person or a society unites itself under that singular vision, then it maintains its orientation, allows people to maintain their hope in relationship to a direction, stops people from experiencing the anxiety that a multitude of competing directions produces, and ensures a productive, generous social unity. Everyone speaks the same language. What does that mean, to speak the same language? It means there's no dispute about what is a woman. When the Tower of Babel becomes too deviant, when it aims itself sufficiently far off the mark, words themselves lose their meaning, and everything collapses. In Babylon, the Tower of Babel, Babel means Babylon. Babylon, in the biblical corpus, stands for the presumptuous civilization. Babylon, Rome, Canaan, Sodom, Gomorrah, they're variants of the idea of civilization gone astray. What's a Tower of Babel? Well, at the time in the Middle East, at the time of Babylonia, there were literal competitions between kings to build the highest structure, the highest ziggurat, the highest pyramid. Not for the glorification of God, let's say, not even to further technological development as such, let's say in the service of life more abundant for the citizens of a given polity, but to provide the emperors, the kings and the tyrants who funded the construction with means of self-aggrandization. The higher the tower, the more the king justified the presumption that he could challenge the divine order. The Egyptians raised their pharaohs to the level of gods, and so did the Romans when their society deteriorated. It's in the nature of an overweening tyranny to elevate its earthly representative to the status of what should be ineffable, to the status of the ineffable and transcendent guiding spirit. And the consequence of that is always that the tower comes crashing down. It came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Now, there's a backstory to this, and the backstory is something like this, is that the people of Shinar decided to centralize, right, and to pass all authority into a centralized authority. That's a good way of thinking about it. Instead of maintaining responsibility and authority in a distributed manner, they centralized. Right? So you can think of these towers as the attempt to build a top-down utopia. That's a good way of thinking about it. A top-down utopia with the wrong spirit constructing it and at the pinnacle. That's the continual technological proclivity of the pridefully obsessed intellect. Cain establishes the pattern of improper sacrifice. Cain's descendants, Cain becomes fratricidal and murderous. His descendants become genocidal and chaotic and technologically obsessed. The consequence of the chaos is the flood. That's the destruction of the world by the return of chaos. The Tower of Babel is the destruction of the world by authoritarian presumption. And those are the two sociological or political catastrophes that are associated with the sin of Cain. So what does that mean? If you refuse to offer your best, and in consequence, your offerings are rejected, you're unsuccessful, you'll become bitter and resentful. If you determine to nurse that bitterness and resentment and let it take you where it wants to, you'll become the murderer of your own ideal, the destroyer of your own hope, and a rebel against the cosmic order. Your descendants will either bring about the flood that eradicates the world, or construct the authoritarian tower that makes everyone whose inevitable consequence is the degeneration of society into incomprehensibility. So what's a totalitarian state? Let's take the Soviet Union. Who's God in the Soviet Union? Well, clearly Satan, but under him, Stalin, let's say, it's Stalin. Well, what does Stalin worship? Power. Okay. How is language demolished under Stalin? Well, what's a totalitarian state? You might say, well, it's the top-down imposition of pathological order by a handful or even a sole actor. But that's naive, because one person cannot control 20 million people. It's not possible. You need an army of willing slaves. If you're going to be a tyrant, you need an army of willing slaves. What sort of slave do you have to be tyrannized by a single tyrant? How about the kind of slave that abandons the meaning of his words? You've all watched Pinocchio. Pinocchio is enticed into pleasure-seeking by the offer of a vacation that he deserves because of his neurotic suffering. The figure that entices him to the vacation paradise is the coachman who drives the chariot, let's say, full of delinquents to the island of hedonistic pleasure. What happens on the island of hedonistic pleasure? The juvenile delinquents destroy the culture, and they turn into brain jackasses who can't say a word. And underneath the palace of pleasure are the slavers waiting to enslave them in the mines. Why do the boys turn into jackasses? Because if you sell your soul to the devil in return for cheap pleasure, your voice will be stolen. You'll sacrifice your voice as an offering. Well, that's why the words decay, right? Because words with no truth have no meaning. They're nothing but babble. The totalitarian presumption is not so much the dominance of otherwise freedom-loving citizens by a tyrant, but the willingness of every single person who dwells inside that tower to use every word they ever utter only to represent falsehood, to maintain the tyrannical tower, and to enslave themselves. The totalitarian state is the total grip of the lie. And the lie, the grip of the lie, is no different than the descent of words into incomprehensibility. And so you might want to remember that the next time you're called upon at your workplace, let's say, or even in the company of your friends, to utter words that you know to be false, or to remain silent when you're called upon by your conscience to say something that you know to be true. You wonder why we can't agree on the most basic facts, let's say, such as, what is a woman? The answer could well be that we've built towers of Babel that are a little bit too high and a little bit too presumptuous. Centralized authority, taking to itself the right to reshape the world as a consequence of nothing but technological prowess in the service of false gods, generates a technological nightmare that destroys meaning itself. And they said to one another, "Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and slime they had for mortar. Now you have to understand that this story is not about the dangers of technology per se. It's not about the evil of the technological enterprise or the evil of knowledge. It's about the willingness to put the technological enterprise, it's about the willingness to make the technological enterprise take the place of God. Right? You can think about it this way. We have hydrogen bombs. That's a pretty close technological approximation to God. Do we have the wisdom to use them or not use them wisely? That's not a technological question. A technology that's not in the service of what is put in the highest place becomes the spirit that builds the Tower of Babel and makes it impossible for people to live together or to communicate. And that's happening around us with incredible rapidity. And they said, "Go to, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven." That's the motif of the displacement of what is properly ineffable and transcendent. That's the replacement of the transpersonal cosmic order with the doctrines that currently dominate. There is a reason the communists attempted to eradicate the religious enterprise. The reason was that the communist dogma and the prophets of the communist dogma wanted to replace the entire enterprise devoted toward transcendence with themselves. And we all know the consequences. All of us who want to know the consequences of that. All of us who want to know that the consequence of that was the descent of an entire civilization into a hell that destroyed tens of millions of people. And not just in the Soviet Union, in Maoist China, still in North Korea, still in communist China for that matter, because everything that's going to happen in communist China has not yet happened. You can be sure of that. Do you know that the Chinese engineers have built Skynet? Do you remember Skynet from the Terminator? Do you know that the Chinese call their 700 million closed-circuit TV camera monitoring system that recognizes everyone's faces and everyone's gait, you know they call that Skynet? Do you know the engineers who were asked about that said, we're building the good Skynet? You know how close we are to that here? The technology's there. We copied the Chinese during the pandemic. If you don't think that we could do that again, you're sadly mistaken. And you might ask, well, what would protect us against that? And the answer is something like the willingness of each of us, the devotion that each of us must manifest to what should be properly put in the highest place.